Hey everyone! I love D&D, and 5th edition is my favorite edition so far. But that doesn't mean it's perfect, and I think most of us agree that a few changes could make things even better. I've provided a series of those adjustments. I've already completed all the classes, and if you are interested, a member of my Discord has adapted those classes to the Fantasy Grounds gaming platform. So if you would like a link to that, there's one in the video description. Today what I want to talk about are some changes just to the basic rules in the Player's Handbook and a couple racial adjustments I've made. In the weeks that follow, I am going to be talking about feats, and then I'm going to be addressing various spells, and that will complete the Treantmonk variant. But for today, we're going to be looking at just the Player's Handbook and some general rules throughout the book. So let's get started. So this is the Treantmonk variant for the Player's Handbook. We are going to begin in Chapter 2 with races. This is going to begin on page 17 of your Player's Handbook, and we're going to begin with the racial traits. So what I've changed here is the ability score increase. And what it now says is each race increases one or more of a character's ability scores. A bonus of +1 to an ability score may be reassigned to another ability score that does not already have a bonus at the time of character creation. What this is going to do is it's basically going to open up the game so that when you pick a class and you pick a race, you can make them work together. This is going to create a lot of variety in terms of class and race combinations that you see at the table. And it's going to make it so that if somebody wants to play an elf barbarian, for example, they're not punished for doing so. The second change I've made is if your campaign uses the optional feat rules from Chapter 5, you may forgo a +2 ability score bonus to choose a feat instead. If you select this option, you may do so only once. This is going to give all the races in the Player's Handbook the option of getting a feat at level 1. Of course, if they do so, they are giving up +2 to an ability score. And if it's something like, let's say you're playing a Hill Dwarf, and you have a +2 Constitution modifier and a +1 Wisdom modifier. If you forgo that +2 Constitution modifier for a feat, and you still would like to have a bonus to Constitution, remember you can reassign that +1 from Wisdom to Constitution now because you are no longer gaining that bonus to Constitution, so it's applicable for that switch. So beyond these general rule changes, I've changed two races specifically in the Player's Handbook. The first one I've changed is the human. Now the human, generally we find that the variant human actually works reasonably well as long as feats are provided in your game. But the general human hardly ever gets played. That +1 to each ability score just doesn't match up with the various things that other races get in the game. So what I've done here is I've made a slight boost to the base human, and we're just going to eliminate the variant human altogether because the variant human is going to become redundant. So now with the human, you get ability score increase. Your ability scores each increase by 1. One ability score of your choice increases by 2. What this means is if you want to give up that +2, you can get a feat. So like with the variant human, we can get a feat at level 1, except we're getting 5 +1 ability score modifiers instead of 2. The second thing I've changed is skills. So now humans will gain a proficiency in one skill of their choice. And this, again, will make variant humans redundant. So a human now is getting everything that a variant human got. But if you are playing in a campaign that doesn't use feats, you can still use the human. And it's going to be far more in line with what we see with other races. The second one I've changed, and this shouldn't surprise anybody, is the Dragonborn. The Dragonborn is a problematic race. I mean, it is a popular race because it's kind of cool. You're playing a humanoid dragon. Who wouldn't want to do that? But they really punish you for making that choice. When we look at other races in the Player's Handbook, they get many, many racial features. Some of them are more flavorful, and some of them are more powerful. But the Dragonborn really only got two racial features. And the first one was their dragon breath, which wasn't very good. You could hardly ever use it, and when you did use it, the damage wasn't good, and it scaled terribly. I mean, at level 1, the damage was reasonably good, but once you get to level 5, 11, 17, as no matter what class you picked, you're liable to get significant boosts in options in combat. The breath weapon becomes just irrelevant, and a Dragonborn player is unlikely to use their breath weapon once they achieve a few levels. So I definitely wanted to make the breath weapon something that you might want to use throughout your career. The other thing I wanted to do is add in some more flavorful abilities to the Dragonborn. Uh, Now, the first thing I did, and I think we would all agree that it was odd that this wasn't here in the first place, is I'm going to give the Dragonborn dark vision. Due to your draconic lineage, you have superior vision in dark and dim conditions. You can see dim light within 60 feet of you as if it were bright light, etc., etc. So this is probably the most obvious change that a Dragonborn needs. Is dragons are excellent in perception. They often have blind sight. We're not even going to give the Dragonborn dark vision. It didn't make any sense at all. So that was the first most obvious change I made. The second change I want to talk about, and actually the first one listed here, right under speed, is bite. If we are Dragonborn, we have essentially what is a draconic head, which would mean that we have a large mouth filled with razor sharp teeth. Now, if you are lizard folk, you have a bite attack, and figured that the Dragonborn should have a similar attack. Your Draconic Maw is a natural weapon, which you can use to make unarmed strikes. If you hit with it, you deal piercing damage equal to 1d6 plus your strength modifier, instead of the bludgeoning damage normal for an unarmed strike. This is the same ability that a lizard folk gets because I figured that a Dragonborn biting would be very similar to a lizard folk biting. Now, this is mostly just a flavor ability, but I thought it was appropriate for the Dragonborn. So, Draconic Ancestry is where you're going to pick your dragon type. You choose one type of dragon from the Draconic Ancestry table. But I've also added, whenever you make an intelligence history check related to dragons, you're considered proficient in the history skill and add double your proficiency bonus to the check instead of your normal proficiency bonus. This is more just a flavorful thing. It's similar to what a dwarf gets with stone cutting, but it makes sense for a dragonborn to be more knowledgeable when it comes to dragons. Now, the Draconic Ancestry table hasn't changed at all. You have the same options, and they give you the same kind of breath weapon. Now, I wasn't sure what to do with the green dragon, because the green dragon provides poison and poison against a constitution save, which makes it worse in multiple ways than the other breath weapons. And honestly, I'm not sure how to make that an easy fix. I considered making it a 20-foot cone just to give it something, but then it really stands out as not fitting into this chart and the way it works. Poison is a problematic thing that I don't have an easy solution for, because the problem with poison is in the monster manual, where they just take so many creatures and give them poison immunity. I honestly think the best way that we can deal with the problem with poison is your DM simply making sure that a number of creatures that you face when you're in combat don't have poison immunity. That's really the easy fix. It's got to come from your DM. And I don't think we can just fix it by some tweaks within the Player's Handbook. But I have improved the breath weapon for all Dragonborn. So now you can use your action to exhale destructive energy. I've heard a lot of people say that they've house ruled it to be a bonus action, but a dragon itself has to use its action to use its breath weapon. And I thought it should be similar, at least, to a dragon's breath weapon. So I kept it at an action, I just made it better. Your Draconic Ancestry determines the size, shape, damage, and type of exhalation. When you use your breath weapon, each creature in the area of exhalation must make a saving throw, the type of which is determined by your Draconic Ancestry. And here's the first change. The DC for the saving throw equals 8 plus your Charisma modifier plus your proficiency bonus. Now, it was originally a Constitution modifier, but the base ability score increases for Dragonborn didn't include Constitution, but they do include Charisma. Now, you have the option now of changing that Charisma bonus, but I think Charisma works nicely in terms of flavor for Dragonborn, so changing it to Charisma I thought was appropriate. Then a creature takes 1d10 damage on a failed save. Now, originally this is 2d6. This actually means that the breath weapon will do slightly less damage at level 1. And half as much damage on a successful one. The damage increases to 2d10 at 5th level, 3d10 to 11th level, and 4d10 at 17th level. So what I've done is, number one, I've changed the levels in which it scales to fit more closely with what we would expect from something like a cantrip. Normally those would scale at level 5, 11, and 17. So I've switched this to match. And now instead of getting a d6 at each of these levels, we're getting a d10. So this is going to be similar to, say, a Firebolt cantrip in terms of damage, except we can hit multiple creatures with it because it's an area of effect. And we're getting partial effect on a successful saving throw. So it is just better than a cantrip. But if we are not hitting multiple creatures with it, it's not going to be super effective. But if we can hit multiple creatures with it, it's going to be reasonably good. And then the final change I've made. After you use your breath weapon, roll a d6 at the beginning of each of your turns after using the breath weapon. On a roll of 6, you can use the breath weapon again. Alternatively, you can use your breath weapon again after you complete a short or long rest. So what I've done is I've given it a recharge, just like a dragon. Dragons can recharge their breath weapon. Now, they can recharge their breath weapon usually on a 5 or 6. I have made this just a 6, but I've included the mechanics that we would normally expect for this kind of ability if it was on an actual dragon for the Dragonborn. And it's going to allow them to use their breath weapon far more often than they otherwise would be able to. Then the damage resistance and the languages will remain as normal. So that is the end of the changes to the races. All the other races in the Player's Handbook, I think, work fine, especially once we include the opportunity to move that +1 bonus to another ability score or sacrifice a +2 bonus for a feat. Then I really think every single race in the Player's Handbook works just fine. Now, there may be issues when we get into some of the source books. I think of the Triton, for example, not getting a +2 ability score, and I'm going to cross that bridge when I come to it. For now, I believe that all the Player's Handbook races work well. That will bring us into the rest of the rule set for the Player's Handbook. I will not be dealing with any rules for feats or for spells at this point. Those are going to get their own treatment because there's a lot more detail involved. But the first thing I'm going to go over is in Chapter 4, under Personality and Background, the rule for inspiration. You'll find this on page 125 of your Player's Handbook. Now, inspiration is a rule that a DM can basically give a player inspiration when they're happy with something that the player did, and that player that can then use that inspiration to gain advantage on a roll. I have a little bit of an issue with the flavor of that, because you have to spend the inspiration before you make the roll. And I don't like that nearly as well as what we see with Bardic Inspiration. With Bardic Inspiration, you're given an additional die, and you can add it after the roll. So when you know that you need it. And I figured Inspiration should have a similar mechanic to Bardic Inspiration. And so that's what I've done. Now with gaining Inspiration, your DM can choose to give you Inspiration for any variety of reasons. Typically, DMs award it when you play out your personality traits, give in to the drawbacks presented by a flaw or bond, or otherwise portray your character in a compelling way. Your DM will tell you how you can earn inspiration in the game. You either have inspiration or you don't. You can't stockpile multiple inspirations for later use. That's all unchanged from the Player's Handbook. The change is to using inspiration. When you gain inspiration, you are awarded a D12. You can roll the die and add the number rolled to one ability check, attack roll, or saving throw that you make. You can wait until after you roll the d20 before deciding to use the inspiration die, but you must decide before the DM says whether the roll succeeds or fails. Once the inspiration die is rolled, it is lost. So this, again, mechanically is very, very similar to Bardic Inspiration now. And I think you'll find inspirations a lot more fun when you can add it after a die roll. That brings us into Chapter 6, the customization options, specifically multi-classing. I have only made one change to the multi-classing rules. For the most part, I think they work reasonably well. But I did make a change to extra attack. This is found on page 164 of your Player's Handbook. It makes no sense to me whatsoever that you can have a 12th level character that has 4 levels of a barbarian, 4 levels of fighter, 4 levels of ranger, and you don't get extra attack. So now with extra attack, if you gain the extra attack class feature from more than one class, the levels of these classes add together. Whenever you multi-class two classes that provide the extra attack feature at level 5, you may add your levels in each of these classes together for the purposes of gaining this feature. Your levels from each class are not added together for the purposes of gaining additional extra attacks like the fighter's version of the extra attack provides. The Warlock's Eldritch Invocation Thirsting Blade doesn't give you an additional attack if you already have extra attack, and if you choose a subclass that provides the extra attack class feature, you may add levels in another class that provides the extra attack feature for the purposes of gaining this feature. If one or both of these classes provides the extra attack feature at a level higher than level 5, you must achieve the higher level before getting this feature. So this is how this would work. Let's say you take 2 levels of fighter. And then you decide to multi-class, and then let's say you go into Paladin. Once you achieve that 3rd level of Paladin, since both Fighter and Paladin provide extra attack at level 5, you would get the extra attack at that point. Now, let's say instead of going into Paladin, you decide to go into a class that normally wouldn't give you extra attack at level 5, but you choose a subclass that will give you an extra attack. Usually that would be at level 6. So when we get 3 levels of that class and choose that subclass, we have a total of 5 levels, so we wouldn't get extra attack yet. But if we took another level in either that subclass or in fighter or any other class that provides extra attack, then we would get that extra attack at level 6. So you're just basically choosing the higher level of the two. So what this is going to do is it's going to open up martial classes to much better multi-classing options, because that is a big problem of multi-classing martial classes is the extra attack and delaying it. And it doesn't make sense to me that you would have to delay it when you're choosing 2 classes that would get it at level 5. So we're changing the rules so that now you can get that. But keep in mind this is only for the level 5 extra attack feature, so you can't use it with a fighter towards getting your additional extra attacks that would come at levels 11 and 20. Those extra attacks require straight fighter. That brings us into Chapter 8, Adventuring, and I've made changes to both the short rest and long rest rules. This is going to be on page 186 of your Player's Handbook. So a short rest is a period of downtime, at least 1 minute long, so that is much, much less than in the Player's Handbook, during which a character does nothing more strenuous than eating, drinking, reading, and tending to wounds. A character can spend 1 or more hit dice at the end of a short rest, up to the character's maximum number of hit dice, which is equal to the character's level. For each hit die spent this way, the player rolls the die and adds the character's constitution modifier to it. This is all the same, and then you regain hit points equal to the total. The other change here is a character regains their hit dice upon finishing a long rest, as explained below. I'll go over that some more. And you may take up to 2 short rests before completing a long rest. So what the changes here provide is that we know that there are campaigns where short resting just doesn't happen. There's just not an opportunity to do it. There's other campaigns where you can short rest all the time. In both those cases, that creates a problem because some of the classes gain their features back on short rests, and some of the classes get their features back on long rests. And the balance between those classes depends on short rests being available, but not being too numerous. So these changes simply provide a way to keep that in balance. Now you just get that little chance to regain your breath after a combat, and that can be your short rest. But you can only take 2. And so we would assume that now this is going to be pretty standardized. You're basically going to be taking 2 short rests between every long rest. And then the long rest, and here's my change there. At the end of a long rest, a character regains all lost hit points the character also regains all spent hit dice. Uh, the rules, as they are written now, provide you half your hit dice back on a long rest. This is complicated and tough to keep track of. And some players keep track of it and other players don't, and it creates other problems there. Let's just give everybody back their hit dice on a long rest. Yes, that means you will be able to spend more hit dice on short rests when you are adventuring for multiple days. I don't think that's going to be a problem. A little bit of extra in between combat healing on a long adventuring cycle isn't going to break your game. And it is going to make things easier. You're not going to need to keep track of, are you sure, did you still have those hit dice? Didn't you yesterday spend this many hit dice? That just doesn't help your game at all. And although it's written in the rules that way, I don't think it helps the rules. I really think we're better. Just give the players back their hit dice on a long rest. And now nobody has to keep track of it. Now, if we are giving everybody a little bit more healing with resting, then it would stand to reason that we might adjust things to make things a little tougher for them in terms of hit points as well. And I've done that with the combat rules. So we're going to talk about the dropping to 0 hit points rules. You're going to find this on page 197 of your Player's Handbook. When you drop to 0 hit points, you either die outright or fall unconscious, as explained in the following sections. So I've made a change to the falling unconscious rules. If damage reduces you to 0 hit points and fails to kill you, you fall unconscious, see Appendix A. This unconsciousness ends if you regain any hit points. Falling unconscious is taxing on a character. Whenever you fall unconscious due to falling to 0 hit points, you gain 1 level of exhaustion. So this is going to make it really bad whenever you fall down. Now, if you go down once and you gain 1 level of exhaustion, it's not the end of the world. 1 level of exhaustion isn't great, but it's not debilitating, and you're going to get it back on a long rest. The issue here is if you keep falling down, once you gain that 3rd level of exhaustion, you're actually going to have disadvantage on your death saving throws. And if you get 6 levels of exhaustion, you die. So this is going to end that little thing we find, especially at low levels, where a player goes down, they come back up, they go down, they come back up. Healing word gets used just to kind of bring people up when they go down. And you end up with this kind of comical combat situation where everyone's falling down and they're getting back up again. And this affects our tactics in combat too, because we know, oh, I can go down, it's no big deal. So-and-so has healing word, they'll bring me right back up. Now you're going to be careful. If you are expecting that a creature might be able to drop you to 0 hit points, you're going to want to avoid that. Maybe you're going to be a little more cautious. It is going to change how combats work. This is a common house rule, and so this has received extensive playtesting, and it works reasonably well. The second thing I've changed is mounted combat. Specifically, I'm dealing now with not a rule that I'm going to change, but a rule that simply doesn't exist, that needed to exist, and it created a problem with how things work. Because as the rules are written, it doesn't say what happens when you mount a creature in terms of your space, because the creature you mount will often occupy more spaces than your character. So where are you on that creature? When you come up to an enemy, can you attack them? Can you attack them with reach? We don't really know because the rules don't tell you where you are on that mount. So what I've done now is I've implemented a rule. This is a house rule that I've actually seen elsewhere that I think makes the most sense of the various house rules I've seen for mounted combat. So now this is on page 198 of your Player's Handbook. Once during your move, you can mount a creature that's within 5 feet of you or dismount. Doing so costs an amount of movement equal to half your speed. So this is right from the Player's Handbook. Then this is my addition. Well mounted, you occupy the centermost space in the creature space. If the center of the creature space is an intersection, you occupy all spaces which touch that intersection. If mounting a creature would require you to move more than 5 feet, you must provide any movement necessary. So the first thing to point out is if you are, say, a halfling and you're mounting a pony, this is no problem because the pony occupies one space, you occupy one space, it's clear where you are on that mount. If you are a human and you're mounting a horse, it's not clear. because that horse occupies 4 spaces. Which of those 4 spaces do you occupy? Or do you share the spot of that horse? If you share the full 4 squares of that horse, that actually makes a reasonable amount of sense. But what if you're mounting a bigger creature? What if you're mounting an elephant? Then does it make sense that you're occupying all those elephants' spaces? No, then it becomes ridiculous. So this is a rule that addresses all those things. If you mount a horse occupies 4 squares. The centermost point on that horse occupies an intersection. So you would be considered to be occupying all 4 squares of that horse well mounted on that horse. But if you're, say, mounting a creature that, say, takes up 9 squares, then the centermost point would be the center position on that mount. Now, if you wanted to actually attack creatures in melee, you would actually need a reach weapon, and that makes sense. If you are on top of an elephant, you are not attacking creatures on the ground with a dagger, you're just not. But if you have a pike, you potentially could. So again, it addresses that, and it makes more sense. But of course, if you're mounting an elephant, because that center square would require you to move more than 5 feet, you're going to need to provide an additional 5 feet of movement beyond that half movement to mount the creature in the first place. And that makes sense too, because mounting an elephant is going to be harder. It's going to require more movement than mounting a horse. Other than that, mounted combat remains the same. This takes us to my final change to the Player's Handbook rules. Chapter 10, Spellcasting Components. This is on page 203 of your Player's Handbook. As we know, a spell's components are the physical requirements you must meet in order to cast it, and a spell's description indicates whether it has a verbal, somatic, or material component. And I haven't made a lot of changes here. I've just fixed one problem I've always found with these rules. There is a ridiculous complexity to casting with your hands full. Because if you are holding an arcane focus, and let's say your other hand is occupied, maybe it's holding a weapon, for example, then you can cast a spell that has a somatic and material component, but you can't cast a spell that has a somatic component and no material component. And that just doesn't make any sense. It's overly complex. And it doesn't work with some of the subclasses that provide you, say, a weapon as a spell focus because of that odd complication. So I've kept the verbal component unchanged, but somatic has changed. So now, if a spell requires a somatic component, the caster must have free use of at least one hand to perform the gestures. A caster may perform a somatic component for a spell if they are holding an applicable spellcasting focus for the class or subclass that provided the spell. So what I've done with the material component is I've just removed the section about holding a focus and completing somatic components, because I've now covered that in the somatic components. And I've basically just simplified it. If you are holding a spellcasting focus for the spell you're going to cast, it doesn't matter if it has a material component or not, you will be able to complete the somatic component. And that's it. And that is all the changes I've made to the Player's Handbook rules. There were lots of changes that ended up on the cutting room floor here. I just didn't want to bog this down with a bunch of minor tweaks that don't make a big difference. So there were lots of things I looked at that I might have modified a little bit. I was looking at changes to like the weapon charts, for example. And again, these things just didn't make the final cut because I didn't think they add enough to the game to be worth needing to reference all the time. So this is a scaled down version where I just took on the things that I thought were a problem. The things that I thought changing it would make your game better. So that is the Treantmonk variant for the Player's Handbook rules and for races. Next week, I'm going to be talking about feats. I think I can do that in one video, but it is going to be a longer video than most of these variant videos are because there's a lot of feats to go through. And then I will be going over spells, and that will be multiple videos. My plan at this moment is to do one level of spells at a time. So I'll do one video for all first level spells, one video for all second level spells. And most spells I won't be changing at all. I will only be looking at spells that I think are a problem, and I'm going to try to make them not a problem anymore. So that's what's coming with the Treantmonk variant. I hope you'll join me next week for my feat video. Until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you next week.